This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hello, friends. I'm Tim O'Brien. When I connected with our guest today, Brooke Siem, I thought, how does this name sound familiar to me? And then after we scheduled today's interview and I started to do my research, I figured it out. If you watch the Food Network's program called Chopped, it's one of their hit shows. You may remember her too. The show's where chefs, a group of chefs, compete as they prepare a three-course meal. Brooke was a winner of that competition in 2017. One of the things I learned in my research was Brooke was going through her own struggles at the time of that show. Before we get started, if you're watching on YouTube or on Rumble, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening, wherever you're listening, make sure to give us a good rating and review. As I mentioned, today we're joined by Brooke Siem. She's now a writer, a speaker, and an advocate for the practice of safe de-prescribing for psychiatric drugs. In 2022, she published a memoir. The memoir is about her struggles with antidepressant withdrawal. The title of that book is called May Cause Side Effects. And as I mentioned, she's also a chef. She co-founded New York City's Prohibition Bakery in 2011, and she was crowned, as I said, a Food Network Chopped champion in 2017. Welcome to the podcast today, Brooke.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
One of the things I normally do when I do interviews is I start at the beginning with someone's story, but I think that part of the story that I just mentioned is something that is a good launching off point for this. And that is when you were on that show called Chopped. And I know I mentioned you had some struggles going on, but I wanted to ask you about the professional feeling, the sense of accomplishment you had by being on that show, since you are a chef.
Yeah, Chopped was one of the most intense days of my life and most emotional, which is saying a lot given the fact that I wrote a book about it and how bad another experience was. But the thing about Chopped that I think people don't realize when they're watching it at home is it's very, the clock is real. You only have 20 minutes or whatever it is to do your thing. And you're just very aware of how you're representing yourself and your business. And it feels like there's a lot on the line because it's national television. And so it's not like you get a chance to put your best work forward. You're under pressure. You have to work within the confines of a very intentionally difficult and amusing competition. So the whole time I was just so aware of, trying not to embarrass myself or my business or just make a complete mockery of the industry or my skills. And that was really pressure filled. And then on top of that, you're not sure, are you going to get chopped? You not? And then, the producer comes and, sits you down and says, well, how do you think your dead dad would feel about this? And you start crying because you didn't expect that to come into the conversation, and you're mic'd the whole time and someone's escorting you to pee. And it's just weird and intense and delightful if you win, which I did. So I think walking out with a handful of cash was gives me a pretty positive light on the whole experience. If I had felt like I didn't do well, then I'm sure I wouldn't talk about it as much as I do.
How did you get interested in cooking? When did that start? Or when I say cooking, I should say baking. You're a chef. So how did you get interested in it? Where did that start?
Yeah, I actually specialize more in savory, even though I owned a bakery. Most of my career and my focus has been on, your chickens and your fish as opposed to your cakes, but with the exception of the bakery. As a very little kid, I was, putting dough twigs and herbs into a pot or a bucket and then making soup with pond water in the backyard as a form of entertainment. And I learned how to use a stove and cook eggs for myself very early, 3-4 years old. And really, as I got older, my mom hates cooking, still doesn't like food. Going to a restaurant with her is just not an inspiring experience. Like, the goal is to find a plain baked potato for her, and that's kind of it. So I realized pretty early on that if I wanted flavor in my life, I was going to have to learn how to do it myself. And so I did. I was also an only child. I had time. I was used to entertaining myself. So I just started to learn in the kitchen. And then I went to culinary school after regular undergraduate school because food was still the only thing that I had a consistent interest in. And then I was working in kitchens. I was in culinary school, and the economy crashed in 2008, and I just kind of got stuck a little bit, honestly. My backup plan was to go get a degree, or not get a degree, was to go get a job at Goldman Sachs or some other investment firm because I was living in New York. That was what all my friends did from my bougie liberal arts school. But then when the economy crashed, that wasn't an option. So I just ended up in the industry, and I stayed there. And there's been a push and a pull of whether or not I want to stay in or get out for most of my career. That persists to this day. But I know how to cook good food. So there's that.
Well, your journey is taking you really through a sort of circuitous route to become an advocate, because obviously you were trained to be a chef, but your life has really prepared you for this moment. And you kind of alluded to that in one of your comments just a few minutes ago. And that is, you talked about being on Chopped. Mm-hmm. And I had mentioned that you're now an advocate for antidepressant withdrawal, and you've wrote a memoir, or you wrote a memoir on that. But you mentioned that the producers asked you how your dead dad would feel about this. And I think that's probably where this story and this book and everything sort of stems from. So could you tell us about that? You were on antidepressants. How old were you, and when did that get started?
I was 15. My father suddenly passed away, and pretty quickly I was taken to a child psychologist because that was just, I don't know. A lot of that time is so fuzzy in many ways. And also I was grieving, I was in shock, and I was also in a weird place between, I was 15. I was more of a child than an adult. So when I talk to my mom about it now, she says that people were just worried about me. My grades were slipping a little bit. I was a very serious ballet dancer. I had taken a break. I just wasn't really grieving in an outwardly obvious way. And so we thought, okay, maybe she needs to work through some stuff, I guess. And so I was taken to this child psychologist who I did not like. I didn't want to be there. And within a few sessions, she called my mom and said, what your daughter needs is a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. I'm diagnosing a depressive and anxiety disorder and recommending medication. And it was 2001. My mom, trying to be a good mom who follows the experts, took me to a child psychiatrist, and I walked out of that appointment with this script for an antidepressant. And over the course of, I'd say the next, couple months, I ended up on a combination of Effexor XR and Wellbutrin XL, which weren't approved for use in children and teens at the time, still aren't today, but I still stayed on that combination of drugs for the next 15 years.
You said your dad died when you were 15. How did he die? Was it, I guess the point of my question is, was it sudden or was it something that took time?
It was sudden. He had pancreatic cancer, but we didn't know, or at least my mom and I didn't know. We have some running hypothesis that maybe he knew something was serious and he didn't say anything. But it was kind of a classic pancreatic cancer story where he had some abdominal pain and went in for what they thought was going to be a routine ulcer surgery. And he pretty much never came out of surgery. So my mom and I weren't even in the country at the time because we thought that this was going to be so routine. But, we left Reno, where I grew up. We were in Italy trying to visit family, and we got a call saying, you got to come home. And when we came home, he never regained consciousness.
And you said that other people, the adults in your life, looked at you and they felt you were a little bit too stoic about it.
Mm-hmm.
How, looking at it through your eyes at the time, how did you see it? Would you say you were stoic, or what were you trying to do at the time? Were you just trying to keep it together and not let the world see?
Every time I go through something difficult now, I watch how I react to it, and I just notice a pattern. And I don't know how much of this is baked into who I am as a person and how much of it is the training I had from a very young age to be a serious ballet dancer, because ballerinas are programmed to effectively smile through the pain. It's a brutal, brutal sport, and you don't show discomfort when you're doing it. And so I think that a good part of me took that lesson that I had been learning since I was 3 years old and applies it still to life. People tell me all the time, they have no idea how I'm feeling, or I could be going through something really hard, and they very often wonder why I just look determined, or that I just like my emotion isn't on my face. And so I think that that's what I was doing at the time, combined with the shock. I just remember, I don't remember feeling any one way or the other. I mean, I don't really feel like I was doing anything other than just kind of waking up and looking around and saying, okay, well, we're still here today. What happens? I still had to go to school. I still had to think about, at the time, it was the SATs and going to college. It's just, life didn't really stop around me. And so I kept going too. And I felt like I was on an island. I did feel different from my peers, but I didn't necessarily think there was anything wrong with me.
I can't imagine what you were going through, but I do know in my own experience, I remember I was older than you were at that time. I was in my early 20s when my dad had sudden heart surgery, and we were up all night because it was an emergency. So we were in the waiting room, and I remember seeing him on all these machines before I left the hospital, and the doctor said he's fine. So I took their word for it, and I can still remember it was probably about maybe 5 a.m. whenever I left the hospital, and I went home and took a shower, and I went to work that day. And my rationale, when I think back on that, was I wanted some kind of normalcy in my life. Would you say that was something to do with you when you were in 15?
Yes, for sure. Everybody knew, everybody at school knew, my teachers knew. I didn't, and especially as a 15-year-old, I wanted to disappear and also have everyone feel sorry for me at the same time, which I think is a very 15-year-old reaction. I knew that this made me different, and part of me really wanted to be different, but I'm not sure I wanted to be different in that way. And so it was uncomfortable to have all of this attention on me and also have it be something that I couldn't control. I didn't ask for. It wasn't because of an accomplishment or anything like that. So I did kind of just want to be left alone and go about my day to day. And also I still, like, what was the other choice? I mean, that's still how I feel about this stuff, right? What other choice do you have other than to get up and take a shower and keep putting one foot in front of the other? Seems obvious to me.
That is so true, and so everybody can relate to that. And when you put yourself in the shoes of your mother, and again, the adults in your life at that point in time, they all want the best for you. They think they're doing the best thing for you at that time, and your mother takes you to a psychologist, and the psychologist transfers you to a psychiatrist. And little did you know, or anybody know at that point in time, they were putting you on a track.
Mm-hmm.
I thought there was something that you said that I wanted to bring up here, because I want to ask you about this. You said it only takes 5 minutes to prescribe a psychiatric drug, but it takes years to get off of them. Would you say that the adults had any idea, and I'm including the doctors and the psychologists and psychiatrists, did they have any idea what they were doing at this point in time to you, creating an addiction?
No, they didn't have any idea then. And I would like to think that doctors have more of an idea now, because it's been 23 years since I was prescribed, and there's a lot more evidence of the long-term harm of these drugs, and they're still completely out to lunch as a general blanket statement. But especially in 2001, we were coming off the cultural temperature at the time was Prozac was the miracle drug. It was on the cover of Time magazine. There were major campaigns run by the National Institute of Mental Health that were funded by Eli Lilly, who makes Prozac, about depression not being your fault. And, oh, here's this drug with very little to no side effects. It's totally safe. The tagline for Prozac was better than well. And it was so new that there wasn't enough time to see what happens when people are on these drugs for longer than the 12 weeks that the trials, longer than a 12-week trial. It feels actually quite similar to what's happening with Ozempic right now, where it's just nothing but, for the most part, nothing but roses. And there are some people who are, trying to wave their arms and say, hey, maybe we should consider the long-term implication of this. And everybody else is like, no, I get what I want right now, and also money, right? So that's what the world was like with Prozac when I was put on these drugs. And so I was, Prozac had only been approved for use in children and teens a bit before, same with Zoloft. Those are the only two that were approved for use in children and teens at the time. And so it was just really an experiment. But it was one that was couched in very, very friendly, kind, harmless rhetoric. So nobody thought that they were doing anything that would affect the rest of my life. Nobody thought that they were doing anything that would affect my entire body. Nobody thought that it would affect the choices I make and the way I experience the world. The thought was, again, the tagline for Prozac is better than well. Why wouldn't we give her something that makes her feel better? That was it. And for me, I'm 15. I'm not in a position to question that. If they tell me it's like taking an aspirin for a headache, well, okay. It was all, I don't know about the psychiatrist and the psychologist, what their motivations were, but my guess is it was all couched in altruism, and they all thought they were helping.
When you took the medications, did it help you even for the beginning, or how would you describe the impact it had on you?
I tried 2 different antidepressants before landing on the combination of Effexor and Wellbutrin, and I know that those 2 antidepressants caused obvious physical side effects right away. I'm assuming those were Prozac and Zoloft. I don't quite remember because the records have long been destroyed and it's been 24 years. But because those were the ones that were approved for children and teens at the time, I'm assuming that's what we tried. So with both of those drugs, I had very clear side effects. One just kind of knocked me out. I couldn't stay awake in class anymore. And the other one made my heart race. And so by the time we went on Effexor and Wellbutrin, I honestly don't recall feeling any better or worse. There's a chance that maybe I was numb. I'm sure I was more numbed out, but I didn't get better. I developed a pretty severe eating disorder after these drugs. So I don't really think they helped is the point I'm trying to make. But I also was not really home mentally or emotionally. I don't have a lot of memory from that time. My mother says she didn't notice a particularly big difference either.
You wonder about that. So obviously you had your issues when your father died. You were dealing with it however you knew how to deal with it as a 15-year-old. Your parents and the adults tried to do things that were helpful to you. You just described how the medication did or did not affect you. And like you said, whether you would have had that eating disorder or not, you can't necessarily blame the drug, but obviously it didn't prevent it.
Yeah.
Did the other kids notice anything about you? Was there a before and after effect on your personality?
No, I don't think so. Because I didn't tell most of the other kids that I was on antidepressants. It was not a badge of honor, and it was not something everybody else was doing at the time. So it wasn't something that I chose to share. And what I will say is I did internalize the message that it was not my fault, and by that I mean I was effectively told that I had a problem that was out of my control. So I had a chemical imbalance in my brain, and that's why I felt the way I did. And the way that translated through me was, well, this isn't my fault. It's not my fault that I feel crappy, and it's not my fault that I don't like my life. It's because I'm sick. And so that it fully took away my agency. I did not learn the lesson that I had the power to change how I felt because I couldn't feel anything. And also that if I didn't like something in my life that was producing a negative effect in me because I didn't feel anything, that I could change that. And so I really entered into a path of least resistance very, very quickly. And that is really what changed the course of my life more than being on the drug itself. It's how it changed my perception of the world. So I don't really remember, the people around me didn't really know what was going on. My friends didn't notice anything different. At that point in time, I made a lot of new friends. And so I just kind of was who I was to them.
One of the things that we all see every time you watch television and there seems to be a drug advertised,
Yeah.
there's always that disclaimer where they have all the side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't take any drugs, but I watch these commercials, and what gets me or gets my attention is when you have an antidepressant and they list all the side effects, and one of the side effects is suicidal thoughts.
Uh-huh.
And I'm thinking it's supposed to prevent that, yet that's a side effect of it. And I get that on the chemical side of it because you're fooling with the balance. But what's your take on that when you see those side effects on the commercials?
It's so clever because if you go back to the early days of Prozac when they were researching and getting the drug approved in the 70s and 80s and 90s, they knew, Eli Lilly, I think it was just Lilly at the time, knew that these drugs induce suicidality and that there are a bunch of lawsuits from that time. But because it's mental health, there was this creative ability to say, oh, it's not the drugs that are the problem, it's your mental health condition. And then the blame gets passed. And this is a big reason why class action lawsuits are so difficult for psychiatric drugs, is because unless you can prove through some sort of genetic, like you have a genetic mutation or a genetic inability to metabolize the drugs, which has then led to a horrible thing happening, it can just get passed off as, oh, well, you were going through a hard time. Your dad died. You have diagnoses that existed pre-taking this drug. All the side effects just get passed off. And that's been one reason why lawsuits against these drugs have been difficult. So, and for me, I didn't feel like I had suicidal ideation in a serious way when my dad died at all. I mean, when I go back and look at what was going on, I wasn't at risk of doing a bunch of drugs or getting pregnant. I didn't start hanging out with the wrong crowd. My grades didn't slip. I wasn't going to ruin my life. There was no active crisis that was happening. It was more of almost a preventative measure in a way. But by the time I was 30, I was much closer to derailing my whole life one way or another because I had been medicated for 15 years and I was actively suicidal at that point. I didn't think it was a big deal. I just didn't want to be alive. And so I thought that if I am this depressed and having suicidal ideation on these drugs, holy cow, what would I be like without them? And that is the trap people get stuck in because they don't realize that long-term exposure to these drugs can actually induce worse depressive feelings. It can induce, it can be the cause of suicidal ideation. And not only that, your life's still a mess because you haven't had the ability to recognize that it's a mess and make changes. And so they just think that, well, if I go off these drugs, I'm going to be even worse. Or what can also happen is sometimes people go on them in times of bad situations where, you hear people say these drugs saved my life. Well, they think that if they get off the drug, that they're going to go back to the place that they were, which again is unlikely to happen because we can never go back. We've gained tools, we've gained experiences. And then, they go into withdrawal and they really think they're crazy and things totally fall off the rails. But
you mentioned you were 30. So you went through this 15-year period. You were 15 when you started. Mm-hmm. You were 30 when you took yourself off of them. And I have a couple of questions about that when you're 30. But over the course of the 15 years, how would you describe I asked you about the immediate impacts on you, but how did the drugs affect you over the course of 15 years?
When I was taking them, I didn't realize that they were having the effect that they were having. I didn't understand how they had affected not just my emotions and my psyche, but my entire physical body until I started to get off them and went into antidepressant withdrawal, because that's when my whole body is kind of started to wake up. And I like literally, when I stopped taking Effexor, by the way, I saw a doctor and I followed her advice. So I tried to do what I was supposed to do, and everything still blew up on me. But literally, when I was in antidepressant withdrawal off of the Effexor, within about a week, the way I saw color changed. And that was my first indication that basically I felt like I had been sold a lie. I had been told that these drugs would make me a little less sad. I had not been told that they would affect the way I literally saw color and interpreted the way the world looked. And I figured, oh my goodness, if they could have such an intense effect on my perception of color, what else have they affected in my experience in my body? And as it turned out, everything. But I didn't realize it when it was happening, in part because I was going through puberty at the time that I was medicated. So I was filled with physical and emotional changes anyway. So by the time I got through that period, I had done that under the influence of these medications. And so I just assumed my brain and body was how it would have been without them. I for the most part have come to terms and am not full of anger over what happened to me and how mismanaged my care was. But the one thing where I get really hung up on that still makes me really emotional is just like, what have I lost in my connection to my body? And because, like, what did I lose because of this? You know, I'm sitting here in a room right now that you can't see, surrounded by canvases, because I have had this like intense need to paint. And I didn't feel creativity once when I was medicated. And in withdrawal, when I started to come off the drugs, this like deep need to create came back quickly. And I couldn't sleep either. So I would be up in the middle of the night with watercolors, making shitty watercolors. And sorry, I don't know if I can swear. I'd be up in the middle of the night making bad watercolors. And I was just so shocked at the fact that I actually wanted to do it. And I wanted to learn, because I didn't want to do anything. I didn't have creativity. I couldn't see the color. And now I'm 38, I'm surrounded by canvases, and I wonder, is this something that was in me the whole time? Like, what would my life have been like if I had the ability to see this and feel this? You know, what about my relationships? I couldn't connect with people. You know, does that explain why I feel pretty isolated now? And it's just not having the answers to that and feeling like some man who I didn't know made that choice for me when I was 15 just pisses me off and makes me so sad.
Yeah, obviously. And it's still, you took yourself off the medications when you were 30, you're 38 now. That's 8 years. Mm-hmm. And you've done enough media interviews and you've written your book, and I can see that it still affects you like it were yesterday. One of the things that I wondered as I read your story, and then I did come upon your comments about your mother, mm-hmm. because I wondered as a father myself. I have 2 sons. They're grown now, but when they were younger, when I read your story, I thought, I might have believed those doctors. I might have taken my son or daughter to a doctor and trusted them. The doctors may trust everything, whatever. Everybody trusts everybody, and they follow this process. And I wondered about your relationship with your mother after you realized all this was not a good thing for you. And you said this, I wanted to bring this up. You said, I hold no resentment towards her, your mother, or the choices she made, because I know that she was doing the best she could do. And she was also grieving, which she was. Mm-hmm. And that is tough for a parent, because you've just lost your spouse. You want your daughter to be perfect as she can be. And she does something out of the goodness like this and all the best of intentions as your mother. And this happens to you over the course of 15 years. And then you said you and your mother still have a great relationship. So could you talk a little bit about that, how that started it when you were 15 and how it is now?
I stand by what I said about holding no resentment. And I think that a lot of that just is, I guess we got kind of lucky, we just have a good relationship. And my dad dying actually was really the catalyst for the strength of our relationship, because I don't have any siblings. So growing up, it was just the three of us. And so when we went from 3 to 2, there just wasn't anybody else. And we really went through that together, because my mom and I were together in Italy when my dad was dying. And so there's a memory that we both have that we share a lot, where I don't even know who made the arrangements or who figured out how to get us home, because we were in Naples, and we went from Naples to Frankfurt to San Francisco, and San Francisco to Reno really fast. And all the airlines, I remember, were helping us and holding planes so we could, get on there. And when we got from Frankfurt to San Francisco, they gave us some horrible coach meal, and we were both so tired and the food was so bad that we were sitting on the plane laughing so hard we were crying, making these dioramas out of the airplane food, in this moment of knowing we were going home to a horrible loss. And I think there was just something in that where that's bonding. And we kind of knew that it was just going to be the two of us going forward. And somehow that has really kept us going all these years. And again, I bought into the antidepressant story when it was presented to me. And my mother was actually the one who started to question it as she watched me get worse and worse over the next 15 years. And I was the one who said, no, I need these. You don't understand. Much of the same narrative I see people buy into now. And it took me to be the one where the light bulb moment came on and said, wait a second, I shouldn't be this depressed if I'm on this many antidepressants. And when I told her, she said, yes, good, get off of them. But because she has been there the whole time, and she's really been the only one who went through that experience with my dad, our relationship has just been very strong. And by the time I got off of them and I went into withdrawal and I wrote my book, we had just had such a foundation of strong communication and openness that we've talked about her putting me on these drugs when I was 15. And now she actually does, she closed her business that she ran, which was in the financial industry, and she got a bunch of certifications. And now she actually works to help support people as they're coming off of psychiatric drugs. So she now works in the same vertical that I do, because she saw what happened to me. And so we've had so many open conversations about it. We both know we wouldn't make the same choice if we had the information we had now, but we didn't. And by the time I just turned 18, she wasn't in charge of my medical decisions anymore. So it really was on me.
What was the tipping point for you? You said in March of 2016, that's when you made the decision to get yourself off of these. And you didn't know if whatever your problems were at that time were caused by the drugs or they were organic from you. Mm-hmm. But the only way you would know is if you took yourself off of the drugs to find out. Mm-hmm. And take that. And it was a risk, because if the drugs were helping you, the fear was maybe these suicidal thoughts or feelings of harming myself and others could come on stronger. So that was the risk. What was the tipping point for you when you were 30 that made you decide to go ahead and do it?
There were a couple things that happened. The first was that I was having suicidal ideation, but it was not dramatic in any way. I wasn't worried about hurting others at the time. I just didn't want to be alive. And so I sort of figured that things kind of can't get worse. I mean, famous last words. But I didn't know what antidepressant withdrawal was. I didn't know what was coming. And so I wasn't scared of it. What I thought was that, well, there must have been some meaningful advance in the world of antidepressants in the past 15 years. So all I have to do is go see a psychiatrist, tell her this is what's going on. We'll come off the drugs. I'll figure out my baseline in a couple weeks. They'll put me on whatever the new thing is, and I'll just have to take one drug instead of two, and everything will be fine. That was what I thought. But the reason why I was motivated to even get off the drugs to begin with was because I had this bizarre opportunity to travel around the world for a year. and I kind of won almost a little, sort of like a little lottery. And logistically, I was not going to be able to pack a suitcase full of a year's worth of drugs, because not only was I on the antidepressants, but I was also on 4 other drugs that I later learned were dealing with side effects created by the antidepressants. And I had also been on them for most of my adult life. They all came on within about a year of me being on the antidepressants. So I was taking 6 drugs at that point, multiple times a day. We were literally talking thousands of capsules over the course of a year, and the volume just it wasn't going to work. And I wasn't going to be able to rely on getting them refilled wherever I was going, because I wasn't going to major cities and, countries similar to the United States. I was going to be in the middle of nowhere on an island in Thailand, or, Croatia in January. And I just didn't trust that I was going to be able to get the drugs refilled. So that's why I said, okay, let's just go talk to a doctor, like I think is the right choice, and try and find my baseline and maybe replace 6 drugs with 2 or something. And that was the intent.
And you met with that doctor, I know, and the doctor underestimated what withdrawal would be like for you, and explained it that way. How did the withdrawal go? Because you had, I guess you could say, you had doctor supervision when you went through this withdrawal, but did you do it all cold turkey, or how did that work?
I wish your listeners could see the facial expressions I'm making right now. So the first thing was that when I saw this woman, she was super dismissive. I told her I wanted to get off these drugs, and I pretty much had to fight her and say, I'm doing this with or without you. Basically, what do you want to do? And so we didn't start off on a great foot. And then she told me to stop taking my Effexor cold turkey because I was on 37.5 milligrams, which is the lowest dose on the market. And so from her perspective, she couldn't prescribe a lower dose. So, and also from her education, she literally said, you might feel like you have the flu for a few days. And that was pretty much it. And I was in severe withdrawal for a year after being told by my doctor that I would feel like I had the flu for a few days. So she just was, aside from just not being a great doctor and maybe not being a great person, wildly misinformed and undereducated on the subject. And I was not educated on the subject at the time. So again, why should I question it? I was just the patient. That is what had been programmed into me for 30 years. But withdrawal itself was the single most difficult thing I've been through in my life. Like I said, I had to write a book about it because it was so bad. And I think that people needed to know how to recognize it, because there is not a book that had existed on the market for prescribers and patients. But it was complete psychological torture. I was filled with violent thoughts about myself and others that I'd never experienced before. Like I said, my vision completely changed. My hearing changed. I had mood swings that were just awesome in their and I mean that in classical sense of the world, in their scope. I could snap and be just a level of rage where I literally at one point bent a metal ironing board in half. And I am not a big person. It was just the intensity of the emotion that was flowing out of me and changing was impossible to predict and felt completely out of my control. I stopped sleeping. My gut was absolutely wrecked. I developed a condition called nodular vasculitis, which is an autoimmune response in the blood vessels to extreme stress, where basically the blood vessels kind of constrict and you get what looks like BB gun pellets that are lodged under your skin. That's what it looks like and feels like. And this weird kind of purpley bruising like rash. And so my arms and my legs, I had these nodules all over my body, and it just felt, it was really painful. I just thought I had some sort of cancer or something. And then instead I just had this mysterious condition caused by stress that confused every doctor I went to. And this went on for a year. And then at the end of it, I was spit out, and I finally got to a place where I felt like withdrawal wasn't running my life anymore. It was severe for about a year, more tolerable, and I felt like I was improving for about another year. But then I was 32 too at that point. I had no idea who I was. All I knew was that every choice I had made while medicated was not right for me, and I had to completely start over. And that in some ways was even harder because it was a complete identity confrontation of who am I? What do I like? I literally didn't like the same music or the same foods. I had to learn how my body existed in a world without these drugs. I spent tens of thousands of dollars in years fixing my gut because they had been so screwed up. I mean, it's been 8 years since I've been off the drugs, and I'm still dealing not so much with withdrawal, but the consequences of that long-term medication.
And I mentioned up front, you were on the show Chopped, and you were going through withdrawal. That whole period you just described of withdrawal with all those anxiety and everything, you were going through that while you were on television. So that was the struggle you were going through at that time.
I got lucky on that day because there's a concept in withdrawal called windows and waves, where the window is a day when your systems just kind of calm down. You feel some clarity. A lot of people describe it as feeling like the person you actually are without medication. It's different than being medicated, and it's different than being sick. It's just kind of like, oh, might be like things are going okay. I feel okay. It's how you want to feel. And then that's contrasted with what's called a wave, which is when the withdrawal symptoms just hit you really hard and you can be terribly unfunctional during that time. And it's hard to know how much of that's in your control and how much of it's not. It really doesn't feel in your control at all at the time. And I got lucky on the day that I filmed Chopped. I remember the night before, we had a very early call time, 4:30 or 5 in the morning. And I remember I had just a bad wave, a couple bad days of a bad wave. And I thought, I could just not show up. If I don't show up, they can't do anything. And I literally set my alarm and decided I'm going to make the decision in the morning. And I woke up and I made a cup of coffee and was putting on makeup for the camera, thinking to myself, do I even want to go and do this? And I finally just decided to go do it because I didn't want to let people down. I felt like it would be a pretty crappy move to not show up to this thing. And so I went, but there was a lot not shown on the show. I was a much more of an emotional wreck on that day than the producers showed. And I'm very grateful to the editors and whoever decided not to highlight how emotionally volatile I was. But still, that was a good day for me in terms of withdrawal. The fact that I got through it was important because I hadn't really had a win figuratively until that point.
I just have one more question for you, and I'm going to show 2 slides because these are quotes from you, and I'm going to ask you a question kind of related to this. Here's what you said, quote, "What happened then and is still happening now is there's absolutely no time given for kids." You were 15 when you were prescribed this. So you're talking about children being prescribed. "We want them to experience so little struggle, and for some reason, we think that if we don't intervene in the struggle early, somehow it's going to derail the rest of their life." Then you said, "But I think what we're doing here is intervening and derailing the rest of their life because we're not allowing them to build resilience, to feel what it's like to be uncomfortable, and understand that's going to ebb and flow. And how do we get out of that?" So you're talking about what you've talked about earlier in our interview, and that is agency.
Yeah.
So here's my final question. What's the solution? If you were talking to the mother, and I know you do talk to the mothers of children who might be prescribed the antidepressants and other drugs, other psychiatric drugs, what would you advise a mother or a dad in that situation?
The first thing is that we need to make a distinction between, are we dealing with an acute active crisis, or are we dealing with fear that something might happen in the future? Because I think these are 2 very different things. People ask me a lot of the time, well, are you anti-psychiatric drugs? And the answer is, in most cases, probably yes. But there are specific and acute cases where these drugs can be really useful. For example, if you've got, a kid who is actively trying to commit a violent crime towards somebody else, it's probably worth sedating them for a little while to get through the crisis, right? That doesn't mean they need to be sedated on these powerful drugs for the rest of their lives. So I think we need to make that distinction. So assuming we're not talking about an active crisis situation, let's go into what I think the real reason why kids are being medicated. It's because life is hard and a difficult kid is difficult on the parents, and parents either don't want it to be difficult or they are just really in a fear-based state because of all the headlines of, young kids committing suicide, and they're trying to prevent it. So I think when I say that kids need time, I mean, the first thing is most things in young life do pass. And the way you learn to deal with life as an adult is by having smaller, less impactful crises as a child that you learn to get through. And if our reaction is to medicate everything that's happening because you don't want your kid to feel bad, or because everybody else is doing it, or because it's being recommended by the school, that's a huge red flag to me. And you got to look at what's going on in the life of the kid if you're having issues, and you got to look at what's going on in the life of the parent. I think 90% of cognitive and emotional issues with kids can be solved by stuff that the parent or the school is doing. I mean, there's no 7-year-old on this planet that can really survive on their own. They are being literally kept alive by the actions of the adults around them. And so therefore, I really struggle with this idea that 7-year-olds have bipolar disorder and are depressed. I think there's something happening in their environment, and that it is being passed off and through a narrative that is people don't even realize that they're being pulled into. So you got to look at the parents. The parents need to take some radical responsibility. You got to start looking at the diet. You've got to look at the environment that the kid is in school. And then you have to, and that's an extreme situation. I mean, honestly, but a good chunk of the stories that people tell me is, oh, I got broken up with when I was 14 and my parents put me on Prozac. Like, what? A breakup is part of how we learn about other people and learn about ourselves. We have to go through hard things in order to be resilient people. That is basic. That's like a law of existence, right? You don't get a strong body without lifting weights or doing exercise. You have to till soil in order to get it to grow. And it just is shocking to me how there's this comfort. We're trying to just wrap everyone in bubble wrap, and then we wonder why when they fall down, they can't recover. We have to learn. Most kids experience a life that lets them learn at an appropriate rate. You don't, obviously horrible things happen to people all the time, but a silly analogy is I remember being every year in school, I would freak out about how hard math was going to be. And I would have an absolute breakdown over thinking I wasn't going to be able to learn fractions that year, or addition, or when it was calculus, differential equations. And every year my mom had to sit there with me and say, you freaked out about this last year, and look what you learned how to do. And we're going to sit and we're going to learn it, and then you're going to have some confidence after it, right? I had to learn that. But now the strategy is, oh, well, one, give them a medication so that they can focus, and also give them an extension on their test. It's like, it's just not productive. And we're seeing that in a generation that is pretty much unfunctional. As again, we're making blanket statements here. I've met some fabulous Gen Zers, but as a whole, they're not thriving.
Brooke Siem, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To learn more about all that we talked about here, please see our episode page at shapingopinion.com. Make sure to leave a rating and review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Want to connect? Check out our website, shapingopinion.com. Follow us on the X platform, Facebook or Instagram at Shaping Opinion. and make sure to join our Facebook group called Shaping Opinion Podcast Listeners. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2024.